I thought the surprise cruise was the most romantic gesture my husband had ever made. Standing at the boarding dock with our luggage, watching the massive ship tower above us like a floating city, I felt a rush of gratitude so intense it brought tears to my eyes. The Miami sun beat down on the pier, and the salt air mixed with diesel fumes and expensive perfume from the other passengers crowding around us. My husband stood beside me, one hand on his rolling suitcase, the other checking his phone with that familiar distracted expression I'd learned to ignore over our 8 years together. He'd presented the tickets 3 weeks earlier on a Tuesday night, sliding the glossy envelope across our kitchen table while I was still wiping down the counters after dinner. Inside were two boarding passes for a 7-day Caribbean cruise, departing from Miami with stops in the Bahamas, Jamaica, and the Cayman Islands. Premium balcony stateroom, all-inclusive dining, couples spa package. Stared at those tickets until the words blurred, my throat tight with emotion. We hadn't taken a real vacation in 4 years, not since his promotion to regional director at the pharmaceutical company, when the demands of his position seemed to swallow every spare moment of his time. The late nights at the office, the weekend conferences, the business dinners that stretched past midnight. I had accepted it all as the price of his success, the sacrifice required for the comfortable life we were building together in our 3-bedroom house in the suburbs of Charlotte. "I know I've been busy," he'd said that night, reaching across the table to take my hand. His palm was warm, his grip firm and reassuring. "But I want to make it up to you, just you and me. No work, no distractions. 7 days to reconnect." I'd cried then, pressing my face against his shoulder while he held me in our kitchen, the dishes still soaking in the sink. I'd felt guilty for all the times I'd doubted him, for the moments of loneliness that crept in during those long evenings when I ate dinner alone, for the suspicions that occasionally flickered through my mind like shadows I was ashamed to acknowledge. Here was proof of his love, tangible and expensive. He was thinking of us. He was prioritizing our marriage. Everything was going to be fine. If you haven't already subscribed to this channel, please hit that subscribe button now. And to get the conversation going, please leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from. Thank you so much. Now let's get back to the story. The boarding process took nearly 2 hours. We shuffled through security lines, showed our passports multiple times, posed for the official cruise photographer in front of a blue screen that would later be replaced with tropical imagery. My husband kept his phone in his hand the entire time, his thumb moving across the screen in that rapid-fire texting pattern I recognized. When I asked who he was, messaging, he said it was work emergencies he needed to handle before we lost signal at sea. "After today, I'm all yours," he promised, flashing that smile that had first attracted me to him at a college party 12 years ago. "Once we leave port, my phone goes in the safe. Complete digital detox." Our stateroom was on deck 9, starboard side, with a private balcony that overlooked the ocean. The room was smaller than I'd imagined from the brochure photos, but still luxurious by my standards. Two twin beds pushed together to form a king, a small sitting area with a couch and desk, a bathroom with a shower barely big enough to turn around in. But that balcony, that's what justified the expense. I stood outside while my husband unpacked, feeling the ship's engines rumble to life beneath my feet, watching the Miami skyline slowly recede as we pulled away from the dock. Other passengers waved from their own balconies, champagne glasses catching the afternoon light. I felt like I was in a movie, living someone else's glamorous life. The mandatory muster drill interrupted my reverie. We had to report to our assigned assembly station wearing the bulky orange life jackets that made everyone look ridiculous. Hundreds of passengers crowded into the designated areas, while crew members with heavy accents explained emergency procedures in rehearsed monotones. My husband stood beside me, but his attention was elsewhere, his eyes scanning the crowd with an intensity that seemed excessive for a safety drill. I followed his gaze, but saw nothing unusual. Just families with restless children, elderly couples holding hands, young people already tipsy from the welcome aboard cocktails. That first evening set the pattern for what I thought would be our week together. We dressed for dinner in the main dining room, a cavernous space decorated in what I'd call cruise ship elegant, all mirrors and chandeliers and waiters in crisp white jackets. We were seated at a table for 8, paired with 3 other couples who would be our dinner companions for the voyage. There was a retired school teacher and her husband from Ohio, married 42 years, who finished each other's sentences. The young newlyweds from Texas, barely into their 20s, who couldn't stop touching each other, and the divorced sisters from Boston traveling together after their respective divorces finalized within months of each other, determined to reclaim their joy. My husband was charming at dinner. He always was in social situations. He told stories about his work without making them boring, asked engaging questions, remembered details people mentioned. He refilled my wine glass before it was empty, rested his hand on my thigh under the table, leaned in to whisper jokes about the terrible pianist playing in the atrium. I relaxed into the evening, into the fantasy of us as a happy couple on a romantic getaway. The doubts that had been accumulating over the past year felt petty and paranoid in the warm glow of the dining room's flattering lighting. After dinner, we walked the deck, my arm linked through his, watching the black water slide past as the ship cut through the Atlantic. The moon was nearly full, laying down a silver path that seemed to point back toward the home we'd left behind. Other couples strolled past us, their laughter carrying on the salt breeze. The ship's horn sounded deep and resonant, and I felt it in my chest like a second heartbeat. My husband suggested we turn in early, get a good night's sleep before the busy days ahead. In our stateroom, we made love with a tenderness that felt both familiar and strange, as if we were remembering how to be intimate after a long separation. Afterward, he fell asleep within minutes, his breathing deep and even, while I lay awake listening to the ocean and the unfamiliar creaks and groans of the ship moving through the night. The second day began with breakfast on our balcony. Room service delivered fresh fruit, pastries, coffee, and orange juice that tasted like sunshine in a glass. We sat in the plastic deck chairs, our feet propped on the railing, planning our day. The ship would dock in Nassau around noon. My husband suggested we skip the organized excursions and explore on our own, maybe find a local beach away from the tourist crowds. I agreed, happy that he wanted us to have a more authentic experience together. But when we disembarked in Nassau, his phone came back to life. I watched his expression change as the messages loaded, his jaw tightening, his eyes narrowing. He made a call, stepping away from me on the pier, his voice too low for me to hear over the chaos of hawkers offering taxi rides and tour packages. When he returned, he looked stressed. "I'm sorry," he said, and I could hear genuine regret in his voice, or what I believed was genuine regret. "There's a crisis with the merger. I need to find somewhere with reliable Wi-Fi and handle some calls. Just give me 2 hours, maybe 3 at most, and then I'm all yours for the rest of the day." I told him I understood. I told him it was fine. I told him I'd explore the shopping district and meet him back at the ship. What I didn't tell him was that I felt the disappointment settling in my stomach like a stone, heavy and cold. We'd had this day planned. He'd promised no work. But I swallowed my feelings, painted on a supportive smile, and watched him disappear into the crowd, his phone already pressed to his ear. I wandered through the straw markets, looking at handmade jewelry and carved wooden masks without really seeing them. Vendors called out prices, dropping them as I walked past without interest. I bought a pair of cheap sunglasses from a teenage girl with cornrows, more because she looked disappointed by my initial rejection than because I wanted them. Eventually, I found myself at a beach bar, sitting at a wobbly table under a palm frond umbrella, nursing a rum punch. That was too sweet and too strong. A local band played reggae versions of American pop songs. Children splashed in the shallows, while their parents dozed on rented loungers. I checked my own phone compulsively, waiting for a message from my husband saying he was finished, ready to salvage what remained of our day together. The messages never came. By the time I made my way back to the ship, the all-aboard deadline approaching, I was sunburned and slightly drunk, and fighting back tears I couldn't fully explain. I found him in our stateroom, freshly showered, no sign of the stress that had consumed his morning. "How was your day?" he asked, as if we'd merely been in different rooms of the same house, rather than apart for 6 hours of what was supposed to be our romantic vacation. I told him it was fine. I didn't mention the loneliness or the disappointment or the way I'd spent the afternoon constructing and dismissing conspiracy theories about what he'd really been doing. I didn't tell him that I'd called him twice, and both times it had gone straight to voicemail. I pushed it all down, that familiar skill I'd developed over years of being understanding, of being supportive, of being the wife who didn't make waves. That evening, we attended the ship's welcome show, a production number featuring singers and dancers performing medleys from Broadway musicals. The theater was packed, the audience enthusiastic, despite the amateur quality of the performances. My husband sat beside me, laughing at the right moments, applauding at the appropriate times, but I could feel his distraction. His leg bounced nervously. His attention wandered. Twice his hand moved toward his pocket where his phone rested, then stopped, as if remembering he'd promised to keep it put away. After the show, we went to one of the ship's lounges, a dark space with low music and leather seating, where we ordered overpriced cocktails and sat across from each other like strangers on a first date who were discovering they had nothing in common. I asked about his work crisis. He gave vague answers. I told him about the beach, the rum punch, the reggae band. He nodded, but didn't really listen. The conversation kept stalling out, leaving awkward silences that I rushed to fill with observations about the ship, the other passengers, the quality of the drinks. We went to bed before midnight. He reached for me, but I feigned exhaustion, turning on my side, feeling his hand linger on my hip for a moment before withdrawing. I lay in the darkness, listening to the ocean and wondering why I felt so alone while sharing a bed with my husband in the middle of the Atlantic. The third day changed everything. We slept late, missing breakfast, waking to the bright Caribbean sun streaming through the balcony doors. The ship was at sea all day, no ports of call, just endless ocean in every direction. My husband seemed more relaxed than he had been, more present. He suggested we spend the day exploring the ship, taking advantage of all the amenities we'd paid for but hadn't yet experienced. I agreed eagerly, relieved to have him back, willing to forget the previous day's disappointment. We started at the adults-only pool area on deck 11, claiming two loungers in a relatively uncrowded corner. I wore the new swimsuit I'd bought specifically for this trip, a red one-piece that I thought was flattering despite my insecurities about my body. My husband wore board shorts and nothing else, his chest and shoulders showing the beginnings of a tan. We ordered fruity drinks with paper umbrellas, slathered ourselves with sunscreen, and settled in to read the paperback novels we'd brought. For perhaps 45 minutes, it felt like the vacation we were supposed to be having. Peaceful, connected, right. Then his phone buzzed. He'd left it on the small table between our loungers, and I saw the screen light up with a notification. He grabbed it quickly, too quickly, his body, tensing in a way that immediately raised my suspicions. He read whatever message had come through, his expression unreadable behind his sunglasses. Then he stood up, gathering his towel. "I need to make a call," he said. "Work thing, 15 minutes tops." He was gone before I could respond, disappearing through the door that led back into the ship's interior. I lay there on my lounger, staring at the cloudless sky, feeling the sun on my skin and the familiar knot forming in my stomach. 15 minutes, he'd said. I watched the time on my phone tick past. 20 minutes, 30, 45, an hour. The ice in my abandoned drink melted into a watery mess. The couple on the loungers next to mine left and were replaced by a different couple. I reapplied sunscreen even though I was spending more time in the shade than the sun now, just to have something to do with my hands. When 90 minutes had passed and he still hadn't returned, I gave up. I gathered my things, wrapped my sarong around my waist, and went looking for him. It wasn't a rational decision. I wasn't even sure what I hoped to find, but I couldn't just sit there anymore, couldn't keep playing the role of the patient, understanding wife who accepts whatever explanation she's given. The ship was enormous, a floating city with 13 passenger decks connected by a labyrinth of corridors, staircases, and elevators. I started my search methodically, checking the places I thought he might have gone to make a private call. The business center on deck 3 was empty except for an elderly man struggling with the computer's keyboard. The library on deck 4 held only a woman with a sleeping toddler in her lap. I checked our stateroom, thinking maybe he'd gone back for something, but the room was empty, the bed made by the housekeeping staff while we'd been at the pool. I rode the elevator up to deck 12, thinking he might have gone to one of the quieter observation areas at the front of the ship. The elevator was crowded with families heading to lunch, everyone in varying states of sunburn and vacation casualness. A small child dropped an ice cream cone at my feet and burst into tears while her mother apologized profusely. I smiled and said it was fine while ice cream melted on my sandals. The elevator doors opened onto deck 12, and I stepped out into the bright sunlight and warm breeze. This deck was more exposed than the others, with less shade and consequently less crowded. I walked forward, past the mini golf course where a father was teaching his daughter how to putt, past the rock climbing wall where a teenager clung halfway up with a look of terror and determination. The observation deck at the bow was my destination, a semicircular area with loungers and small tables where passengers could sit and watch the ocean unfold before them. I rounded the corner, my mind already composing the mildly accusatory speech I'd deliver when I found my husband, about respecting my time, about communication, about this being our vacation, not just another work day with a different backdrop. I was so focused on my internal dialogue that I almost didn't see them. But I did see them, and once I did, I couldn't unsee it, couldn't unknow it, couldn't go back to the version of my life that had existed just seconds before. My husband was standing near the railing at the most forward point of the observation deck. He wasn't alone. He was with a woman. And not just any woman, not some stranger he'd struck up a casual conversation with while making his phone call. This was a woman he knew, a woman he was comfortable with, a woman who had just reached up to adjust his collar, her fingers lingering on his chest, while he smiled down at her with an expression of such open affection that it felt like a physical blow to my solar plexus. She was younger than me, maybe not by much, maybe only 5 or 6 years, but enough that it registered immediately, tall, where I was average height, blonde, where I was brunette, wearing a white bikini that showed off a body that had clearly never carried a child, never struggled with those last 10 pounds that refused to disappear no matter how little I ate. She threw her head back and laughed at something he said, and even from a distance I could see the intimacy between them, the easy physical closeness of people who had touched each other many times before. My husband's hand was on the small of her back, his thumb moved in small circles against her bare skin. She leaned into him, fitting against his side like a puzzle piece that had found its match. And the way he looked at her, the way his whole body was oriented toward her as if she were the sun, and he was a planet locked in her gravitational pull. That's what made my knees weak, made the deck seem to tilt beneath my feet in a way that had nothing to do with the ship's movement through the water. I stood frozen, partially hidden behind a support pillar, my heart hammering so hard I could feel my pulse in my throat. I should have walked away. I should have confronted them. I should have done something other than stand there like a statue, watching my marriage reveal itself as the fiction it had apparently been for I didn't know how long. But I couldn't move. I could only watch as my husband, the man I'd shared a bed with just hours ago, the man who had looked me in the eye 3 weeks earlier and promised this trip would be about us reconnecting, pulled this woman closer and kissed her temple with such casual tenderness that it was somehow more devastating than if he'd kissed her mouth. They talked. I was too far away to hear the conversation, but I could read their body language fluently enough. She was animated, gesturing with her hands, telling some story that had him grinning. He interrupted her to say something that made her swat his chest playfully. They were completely absorbed in each other, utterly unself-conscious, not bothering to look around to see if anyone might be watching. Why would they? We were at sea, surrounded by strangers, far from anyone who might know either of them. They were safe, they were free. They could be exactly who they were to each other without pretense or hiding, except they weren't safe, because I was there, and I was seeing everything. The woman turned to face the ocean, and my husband moved behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. The gesture was so domestic, so comfortable, that it spoke of a history I hadn't known existed. This wasn't an affair that had just started. This was established. This was ongoing. This was real. My phone was in my hand before I consciously decided to take it out. My fingers moved on autopilot, opening the camera, zooming in as much as the lens would allow. I took photos, lots of them, different angles, different moments, him whispering in her ear, her turning to look up at him with an expression that was unmistakably loving, both of them together, his arms around her, the vast ocean behind them. I documented everything with a strange detachment, as if I were a private investigator gathering evidence for a client rather than a wife watching her husband betray her in real time. The photos were shaky. My hands were trembling so badly that several came out blurred, but I got enough clear ones, enough that would be unmistakable to anyone who saw them, enough that he could never claim I'd misunderstood what I'd witnessed. I don't know how long I stood there. It might have been 5 minutes or 20. Time had gone strange, simultaneously crawling and racing. The sun beat down on my shoulders. The salt breeze dried the tears on my cheeks that I hadn't realized were falling. My legs ached from standing so still, every muscle locked tight. Around me, the ship's activities continued obliviously. Children ran past, shrieking with laughter. A group of teenagers clustered around their phones, showing each other something on the screen. An announcement came over the PA system about the afternoon's trivia competition in the atrium. Eventually, they separated. The woman said something that made my husband check his watch. He nodded, leaned in to kiss her briefly on the mouth this time, not caring who might see, and then headed toward the door that led back into the ship's interior. She stayed at the railing, her face turned toward the sun, a small smile playing at her lips. She looked satisfied, content, like a woman who had everything she wanted. I waited until my husband had disappeared through the door before I moved. My body felt mechanical, disconnected from my brain. I walked away from the observation deck, retracing my steps toward the elevator, my mind eerily blank. The shock was protecting me, I realized. My psyche was putting up barriers against the full weight of what I'd just witnessed, knowing that if I let myself feel it all at once, I'd collapse right there on the deck. Back in our stateroom, I locked myself in the bathroom and sat on the edge of the bathtub with my phone clutched in both hands. I looked at the photos I'd taken, scrolling through them one by one, each image a fresh knife wound. In one, he was laughing, his face more genuinely joyful than I'd seen it in years. In another, his hand was tangled in her hair, intimate and possessive. In a third, they were both looking at something on her phone, their heads close together, and I realized with a sick lurch that this was probably how they communicated when he claimed to be working late. Not phone calls that could be overheard, text messages that could be quickly deleted. I thought about the business trip to Denver 3 months ago, the conference in Boston last fall, the weekend seminar in Orlando that had gotten extended by 2 days because of some emergency that required his presence. How many of those trips had been real? How many had been excuses to spend time with her? And more to the point, how long had this been going on? Months? Years? The magnitude of the deception threatened to overwhelm me. This wasn't just about him having an affair. It was about him bringing me on this cruise, spending money on what I'd believed was a romantic gesture to repair our marriage, all while planning to spend time with his mistress on the same ship. The cruelty of it staggered me. He'd packed us into adjacent realities, managing both relationships simultaneously, apparently confident enough in his abilities to juggle that he'd risked having us in such close proximity, unless she knew about me. The thought hit me with fresh horror. What if she knew he was married? What if she knew I was on this ship? What if this was all some kind of game to them, some sick thrill of sneaking around right under my nose? The humiliation burned through the shock, hot and acidic. I bent over the toilet, certain I was going to vomit, but nothing came up except dry heaves that left my throat raw. I heard the stateroom door open. His voice called my name, casual and unconcerned. I flushed the toilet to buy myself time, then stood at the sink, gripping the edge of the counter, forcing myself to breathe slowly. In the mirror, I looked like a stranger. My face was blotchy and swollen from crying. My eyes were red-rimmed. My hair was a tangled mess from the wind on the observation deck. I looked exactly like what I was, a woman whose life had just shattered. I couldn't face him yet. I wasn't ready. The performance required to pretend everything was normal was beyond my capabilities in that moment. I turned on the shower, as hot as I could stand it, and stepped under the spray, still wearing my swimsuit. The water beat against my skull, drowning out his knock on the bathroom door, his voice asking if I was okay. I stayed under that water until it started to run cold, until my skin was pruned and pink, until I felt some measure of control returning to my shaken limbs. When I finally emerged, wrapped in a towel, my hair dripping onto the carpet, he was sitting on the couch in our stateroom, his phone in his hand, that eternal appendage. He looked up when I came out, and I searched his face for any sign of guilt, any indication that he suspected I knew, but there was nothing. Just mild concern that his wife had been in the shower for 45 minutes. "You okay?" he asked. "You were gone from the pool for a while. I came back and you weren't there." The audacity of the lie was almost impressive. He'd come back to the pool looking for me after spending God knows how long with his mistress on the observation deck. He was willing to pretend his absence had been brief, forgettable, nothing to worry about. And he expected me to accept this story, to nod along, to continue playing my role in the farce of our marriage. I stood there dripping on the carpet, staring at this man I'd pledged my life to 8 years ago, this person I'd trusted with my heart and my future and my sense of self, and I felt something shift inside me. The shock was receding, burned away by a cold fury that was spreading through my chest like frost creeping across a window. He'd made me a fool. He'd made our marriage a joke. He'd stolen years of my life and spent them building a fantasy with another woman while I sat at home believing in us, working to maintain what I thought was real, but was apparently just an elaborate performance for my benefit. And he'd gotten sloppy. He'd gotten arrogant. He'd put us both on this ship and assumed he was clever enough to keep his two worlds from colliding. That miscalculation was going to cost him everything. I forced my face into a neutral expression, pushed my wet hair back from my forehead, and manufactured a smile that felt like acid on my lips. "I'm fine," I said. My voice was remarkably steady, giving away nothing of the maelstrom inside me. "Just got a little seasick. Too much sun and those fruity drinks on an empty stomach." I came back to the room to lie down for a bit. He accepted this explanation with the same unconcerned ease with which he'd delivered his own lies. We were both performers now, I realized, both reading from scripts we'd silently agreed to follow. The difference was that I now knew we were performing, and I wasn't going to keep playing the role he'd assigned me. "Why don't we grab some lunch?" he suggested, standing up and stretching like a man without a care in the world. "I'm starving." "Then maybe we can check out the art auction they're having this afternoon, or just hang out on our balcony." I nodded, moving toward the closet to find clothes, my mind already working through the implications of what I'd learned, already beginning to formulate a plan, because I wasn't going to confront him now, wasn't going to cry or scream or make a scene. Not yet. Not until I knew exactly what I was dealing with, exactly how deep this betrayal went, exactly who this woman was, and what she meant to him. I was going to smile and pretend and play the loving wife. I was going to observe and gather information and document everything. And when we finally got off this ship, when we were back home surrounded by witnesses and legal protections, then I would detonate the bomb that would blow up his carefully constructed double life. He'd brought me on this cruise thinking I was stupid, thinking I was blind, thinking I'd never notice what was happening right in front of me. He was about to learn that the biggest mistake of his life wasn't having the affair, it was underestimating his wife. We went to the buffet for lunch, piling plates high with food I barely tasted. He chatted about the afternoon's activities, suggesting we attend a wine tasting or maybe play some mini golf. I nodded and smiled and contributed to the conversation with an autopilot competence that surprised me. Some part of my brain had taken over, the part that knew how to function in social situations even when I was dying inside, the part that had been trained through years of disappointing marriages and emotional neglect to hide my true feelings behind a pleasant facade. Other passengers bustled around us, laughing families and tipsy couples, and groups of friends on girls' trips or guys' weekends. I envied them their uncomplicated joy, their ability to enjoy this floating resort without the weight of betrayal crushing their lungs. My husband reached across the table to squeeze my hand, and I let him, even though his touch now felt like poison on my skin. After lunch, he suggested we go back to the room to rest before dinner. I agreed, but once we were in the stateroom, I claimed I still felt queasy and wanted to stay on the balcony in the fresh air. He settled on the couch with his tablet, probably messaging her, probably planning their next rendezvous while I sat just a few feet away. The cruelty of it was almost elegant in its simplicity. I sat on the balcony, staring at the endless ocean, my phone in my lap, scrolling through those damning photos again and again. My mind was racing now, the shock finally dissipating enough to let rational thought back in. I needed to understand what I was dealing with. I needed to know who she was, how long this had been going on, what his plans were. Did he intend to leave me for her? Or was she just a diversion, someone to alleviate the boredom of his marriage while maintaining the comfortable stability of his home life? The sun was starting to lower in the sky, painting the clouds in shades of orange and pink that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. The ship's horn sounded, that deep resonant blast that marked the passage of time at sea. Other passengers on their balconies waved to each other, toasted the sunset with their cocktails, posed for photos with the ocean as their backdrop. I watched them all with the distant fascination of an anthropologist observing a foreign culture. My husband came out to the balcony, 2 glasses of wine in his hands, offering one to me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I took it, thanked him, sipped the acidic red while he talked about dinner plans. We were scheduled to eat with our table companions again, he reminded me, the retired teachers and the newlyweds and the divorced sisters. I'd have to perform for them too, maintain the illusion of marital happiness, laugh at jokes, and contribute to conversations while my world was disintegrating. "Are you sure you're feeling better?" he asked, studying my face, with what might have been genuine concern if I could still believe anything about him was genuine. "You still look pale." "I'm fine," I insisted. "Just needed to get my sea legs. I'll be good as new by dinner." But I wasn't fine, and I wouldn't be fine for a very long time. The man sitting across from me was a stranger wearing my husband's face, speaking with my husband's voice, mimicking the gestures and expressions I'd memorized over 12 years together. The real person underneath that mask was someone I'd never actually known at all. Dinner that night was torture. I sat at our assigned table, my face aching from the effort of smiling, my throat tight from swallowing words I couldn't say. My husband played his role perfectly, the attentive spouse who refilled my water glass and asked if I liked my entree and told our table companions a funny story about our first date that made everyone laugh. I even laughed myself, caught up in the memory before remembering that the memory was tainted now, that everything about our relationship had been recontextualized by what I'd witnessed that afternoon. The divorced sisters from Boston were talking about their ex-husbands, trading stories of infidelity and financial betrayal, and lawyers who charged by the minute. I listened with new ears, hearing the hard-won wisdom in their bitter humor, the survivorship in their laughter. One of them noticed me, watching, and raised her glass in a private toast woman to woman, as if she could somehow sense that I was about to join their club of the betrayed and abandoned. After dinner, my husband suggested we take a walk around the deck, and I agreed because saying no would have required an explanation I wasn't ready to give. We strolled arm in arm like the couples in the cruise brochure photos, and I wondered if she was watching us from somewhere, if she knew who I was, if she found some perverse satisfaction in seeing him perform matrimony while planning to meet her later. The thought made me want to scream, to tear away from him and run until I couldn't run anymore. But I maintained my composure, kept my mask firmly in place. He walked me back to our stateroom around 10, claiming exhaustion from too much sun. But I noticed the way his hand moved to his pocket, checking for his phone, the way his eyes kept darting to his watch. He was waiting for me to fall asleep, waiting so he could slip out and go to her, continuing the pattern he'd probably been following for the past 2 nights while I'd slept. oblivious and trusting just a few feet away. I decided to give him what he wanted. I changed into my pajamas, washed my face, climbed into bed, and closed my eyes. I regulated my breathing, made it slow and even, occasionally letting out a soft sound that might be mistaken for the beginning of a snore. I felt the mattress shift as he sat on his side of the bed, felt him watching me, making sure I was truly asleep. Minutes ticked by in tense silence. Then he stood. I heard him moving quietly around the room, the soft rustle of clothing being changed, the muted beep of his phone being unlocked. The stateroom door opened with a nearly silent click, then closed just as carefully. His footsteps receded down the hallway, growing fainter until I couldn't hear them anymore. I opened my eyes. The room was dark, except for the green glow of the alarm clock on the nightstand, and the thin line of light seeping under the door from the hallway. I was alone. My husband had just left our room in the middle of the night to go to another woman, confident that his wife was sleeping soundly, suspecting nothing. But I suspected everything now, and I wasn't going to sleep. I was going to follow him. I moved quickly, but quietly, pulling on dark clothes, sliding my feet into sneakers, grabbing my phone and the room key. My hands were steadier now than they'd been that afternoon. The initial shock had crystallized into something harder, something purposeful. I wasn't acting on emotion anymore. I was gathering intelligence, building a case, preparing for war. The hallway was empty when I slipped out of our room, the harsh fluorescent lighting making everything look sterile and institutional. Somewhere nearby, I could hear laughter and music from one of the ship's nighttime venues. The casino, maybe, or one of the bars that stayed open until the early morning hours. Moved toward the elevator, gambling that he'd go up rather than down, back to that observation deck where I'd seen them earlier, or perhaps to some other secluded spot where they could be alone. The elevator dinged, the doors slid open, and I stepped inside with three other passengers, a young couple who were clearly drunk and very much in love, hanging off each other, giggling at private jokes. They got off on deck 7. I continued up to deck 12, my heart pounding so hard I was sure the sound of it would give me away. The observation deck was deserted when I arrived, empty loungers creating long shadows in the moonlight. I checked the time on my phone. Nearly 11. Where were they? I moved carefully around the deck, staying close to the walls, avoiding the pools of light cast by the overhead fixtures. The ship cut through the dark water, the only sound the constant rush of ocean and wind and the distant thrum of engines deep in the hull. Then I heard voices, low and intimate, coming from around a corner near the mini golf course. I crept closer, pressing myself against the wall, barely breathing. It was them. I couldn't see them yet, but I recognized his laugh, that particular chuckle he reserved for moments of genuine amusement, and her voice, lighter and younger than mine, saying something I couldn't quite make out. I edged forward until I could see them. They were sitting on one of the loungers, her tucked against his side, his arm around her shoulders. They weren't doing anything particularly scandalous in that moment, just talking, but the intimacy was palpable. This was a conversation between people who knew each other deeply, who had shared enough time together to develop their own language of inside jokes and meaningful glances. I took out my phone, switching it to video mode, and started recording. The quality wouldn't be great in the low light, but it would be enough. Enough to prove he'd snuck out in the middle of the night to meet her, enough to establish a pattern of deception, enough to show a judge or a lawyer or anyone else who needed to see it that this wasn't a misunderstanding or an innocent friendship. This was an affair conducted with premeditation and care, hidden behind a wall of lies. I recorded for several minutes, capturing their conversation even though I couldn't hear most of the words, just the tone and rhythm of two people completely at ease with each other. At one point, she said something that made him throw his head back and laugh, the kind of uninhibited joy I hadn't seen from him in years. The sight of it hurt more than I'd expected. Not because I wanted him anymore, not because I still loved this version of him, but because it was proof that he was capable of happiness, of connection, of being fully present with another person. He just wasn't capable of it with me. They stood up, preparing to leave, and I quickly retreated, hurrying back toward the elevator, my mind calculating routes and timing. I needed to get back to our room before he did, needed to be in bed pretending to sleep when he returned. The elevator took forever to arrive, and when it did, it was full of passengers heading back to their rooms after a night of drinking and dancing. I squeezed into a corner, my face turned away, praying he wouldn't be waiting when the doors opened on deck 9. The hallway was empty. I slipped back into our stateroom, changed back into my pajamas, and climbed into bed, arranging myself in the same position I'd been in when he left. My heart was racing, my mind whirling with everything I'd seen and recorded. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to relax my body even though every muscle wanted to stay tense and ready. He returned about 20 minutes later. I heard the door open, heard his quiet movements as he undressed in the dark, felt the mattress dip as he climbed into bed beside me. He smelled different, her perfume maybe, or just the salt air from the upper deck. He settled in without touching me, and within minutes his breathing had evened out into sleep. I lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling, feeling the ship rock gently beneath us, planning my next moves. The cruise still had 4 more days, 4 more days of pretending, of gathering evidence, of watching him live his double life. 4 more days before we returned to reality, where I could consult a lawyer, where I could take action, where I could begin the process of excising him from my life like the cancer he'd become. The sun rose over the ocean, painting our stateroom in shades of gold and pink. My husband slept on, peaceful and undisturbed, while I watched the light change and hardened into someone new, someone who wouldn't be fooled again, someone who wouldn't accept lies and betrayal as the price of marriage, someone who was going to fight for herself with the same determination he'd put into deceiving me. The cruise continued. We had breakfast on our balcony, lunch at the buffet, spent the afternoon at the pool where I pretended to read while actually watching him. Watch the clock, waiting for his next opportunity to slip away. We were in Cozumel that day, and I insisted we stay on the ship, claiming my seasickness had returned. He seemed disappointed but didn't push, probably relieved to have easier access to his mistress without the complication of shore excursions. He made an excuse after lunch, some story about needing to check the sports scores in one of the sports bars where they had television access. I nodded and smiled and told him to take his time. I'd be fine in the room resting. As soon as he left, I began my own search of the ship, systematic and thorough, trying to find where she was staying, trying to learn more about her. I started by going through his phone. He'd left it charging on the desk, a rare mistake that I took full advantage of, but he'd been careful, more careful than I'd hoped. There were no suspicious text messages, no incriminating emails. He'd either deleted everything or was using an app I didn't know about, something that wouldn't show up in his regular message history. His call log showed several calls to numbers I didn't recognize, but without more context, they proved nothing. I moved to his laptop next, the one he'd brought for the supposed work emergency that had consumed our first day in port. It was password protected, but I knew his passwords. He used variations of the same ones for everything, never imagining his trusting wife might try to access his devices. What I found there was more illuminating. Emails going back months, arranging meetings in various cities, discussing plans and hopes and frustrations. No names in the emails, just a generic thinking of you kind of language that could be dismissed as friendly if discovered, but read as romantic when you knew the context. Then I found the booking confirmation. It had been buried in a folder of work documents, probably filed there thinking I'd never look. A cruise reservation for 2 passengers, both names listed, his name and hers. First name, last name, date of birth, passport number, all the information I needed to know exactly who she was. Her name meant nothing to me at first, just letters arranged into words, as meaningless as any stranger's name, but it gave me something to search for, and that's what I did. Fingers flying over the keyboard, pulling up social media profiles and LinkedIn pages and everything the internet could tell me about the woman who'd stolen my husband. She was 32, 7 years younger than me, a pharmaceutical sales rep who worked for a competitor of my husband's company. That's probably how they'd met, at some industry conference or trade show, bonding over their shared profession. Her social media was relatively private, but I could see enough. Photos of exotic vacations and expensive restaurants, and a lifestyle that suggested she made good money and spent it freely. No photos of my husband, of course, no indication she was involved with anyone. Just a beautiful, successful single woman living her best life. Except she wasn't single. She was with my husband, and she'd known he was married. The emails made that clear. References to the situation at home and when you're free, and I understand you have responsibilities. She knew. She'd always known. And she'd pursued him anyway, or let herself be pursued, entering into this arrangement with full awareness that she was helping destroy someone else's marriage. The rage that swept through me then was different from the cold fury I'd felt before. This was hot and sharp, a physical sensation in my chest and throat and hands. I wanted to find her right then, wanted to confront her, wanted to make her understand the damage she'd caused. But I controlled myself. Confrontation would feel good in the moment, but accomplish nothing. Evidence was power. Knowledge was power. I was building an arsenal, and when I was ready to use it, the destruction would be total. I took photos of everything on his laptop, every email, every booking confirmation, every piece of evidence I could find. I sent them all to my own email, then deleted the sent messages so he wouldn't know what I'd discovered. Then I closed the laptop and replaced it exactly as I'd found it, making sure nothing was out of place. When he returned to the room an hour later, he found me on the balcony with a book, the picture of a wife, enjoying a quiet afternoon. He asked how I was feeling, and I said better, much better. We made small talk about his afternoon, his lies rolling off his tongue with practiced ease, while I nodded and smiled and hated him with an intensity that should have been visible, should have radiated from me like heat. But my mask was firmly in place. I was getting good at this performance. That evening, we attended the ship's formal night, dressing in our best clothes, posing for photos with the ship's photographers, like the happy couple we were supposed to be. The camera captured my smile, my hand resting on his chest, his arm around my waist pulling me close. Those photos would be available for purchase later, mementos of our romantic cruise. I wondered if he'd buy them, if he'd display them in our house as evidence of our allegedly solid marriage, or if he'd find them too painful a reminder of his deception once I'd revealed everything I knew. At dinner, I was more animated than I'd been the previous nights, engaging fully in the conversation, asking our table companions about their days, their lives, their own love stories. The retired couple from Ohio described their wedding 42 years ago, a simple ceremony in a small church with just close family in attendance. The newlyweds talked about their elaborate destination wedding just 3 months earlier, the stress of planning, the relief when it was finally over. The divorced sisters shared their own failed marriage stories with dark humor, and I laughed along with everyone else, filing away the details they shared about their divorces, the mistakes they'd made, the lessons they'd learned. My husband was attentive throughout dinner, playing his role with conviction, touching my hand across the table, leaning in to whisper observations that were probably meant to be charming, but just felt like more lies in a tsunami of deception. At one point, the older woman from Ohio looked at us and said, "You two remind me of my husband and me when we were your age, so in love, so connected. Hold on to that. It's precious." I thanked her while something crumbled inside me. We weren't in love. We weren't connected. We were actors in a play that only one of us knew was fiction. The comparison to a couple who'd actually made it work for 4 decades was almost obscene in its irony. After dinner, the ship hosted a champagne art auction, one of those events designed to separate tipsy passengers from their money. My husband suggested we attend, probably because it was a public event where he wouldn't have to maintain our intimate fiction alone with me in our room. We sat in the back of the venue, sipping champagne, while an auctioneer with a headset and a manic energy tried to convince people that mass-produced prints were valuable investments. People bid on paintings of sunsets and sailboats, drove the prices up through a combination of alcohol and vacation spending mindset. I watched my husband instead of the auction, watched the way his leg bounced nervously, watched him check his phone repeatedly, the screen lighting his face in the dim auction room, watched him making calculations I could now read, probably figuring out when he could slip away again, what excuse he could manufacture. I felt like an anthropologist observing the behavior of a newly discovered species, cataloging each movement, each tell, each habit that revealed the truth beneath the performance. When we finally returned to our stateroom that night, I made sure to take my time getting ready for bed, brushing my teeth, washing my face, going through an elaborate skincare routine that I normally skipped. I needed him to think I'd be asleep soon so he'd feel safe leaving again. And sure enough, once I was settled in bed with my eyes closed and my breathing regulated, I felt him wait perhaps 15 minutes before slipping out of the room once more. I followed him again. This pattern would repeat itself for the remaining days of the cruise. Him sneaking out to meet her, me following at a distance, recording their meetings, documenting the affair with methodical thoroughness. I learned her schedule, the times she preferred to meet him, the places on the ship they felt were safe and secluded. I recorded hours of video, took hundreds of photos, built a timeline that would be undeniable in its clarity. During the day, I played the dutiful wife. We went snorkeling in Grand Cayman, my husband pointing out colorful fish while I pretended to care, while I smiled for the underwater camera he'd rented. We took a shore excursion to a waterfall in Jamaica, posed in front of the cascading water with our arms around each other like any other tourist couple. We attended shows and participated in ship activities and maintained the fiction that we were having a wonderful time reconnecting. But at night, I became someone else, someone calculating and cold, someone who was building a case with legal precision, someone who was planning revenge with the same care and attention to detail that he'd put into his affair. The photos and videos accumulated on my phone and in my cloud storage, a digital record of betrayal that would be impossible to deny or explain away. I also started making plans for what would happen when we got home. I researched divorce lawyers in our city, reading reviews, comparing specializations, making notes about who I'd contact first. I looked into the marriage laws in our state, what would constitute grounds for divorce, how assets would likely be divided. I checked our bank accounts and credit cards, documenting our financial situation, making sure I understood exactly what we had and where it was located. Knowledge became my armor and my weapon. On the sixth day of the cruise, we were at sea again. No ports of call, just endless ocean and the hermetically sealed bubble of the ship. My husband had grown more confident in his deception, more casual about his absences. When he disappeared after lunch, claiming he was going to the gym, I didn't even pretend to believe him anymore. I just nodded and told him to have a good workout, my voice flat with an effect I no longer bothered to hide. I spent that afternoon on our balcony, organizing the evidence I'd gathered, creating a timeline, matching dates from his emails with dates from our credit card statements, building a narrative that was damning in its coherence. He'd taken her to dinner at expensive restaurants on nights he'd told me he was working late. He'd bought her gifts that showed up as vague charges on our joint credit card. He'd spent our money, the money from our shared accounts that I'd contributed to during my working years, on his mistress and their affair. The financial betrayal stung almost as much as the emotional one. It wasn't just that he'd been unfaithful. It was that he'd used our resources to facilitate that unfaithfulness, had stolen from our marriage to finance his alternate relationship. Every gift he'd bought her, every dinner he'd taken her to, every hotel room he'd paid for, it had all come from money that should have been ours, money that was supposed to be building our shared future. I thought about the times I'd scrimped and saved, turned down purchases I wanted, convinced myself we needed to be financially responsible and build our nest egg. All while he was spending freely on another woman, never worrying about the cost because he knew I was the one watching our budget, being careful, making sure we had enough. The hypocrisy made me want to break something, to scream until my voice gave out, to find him and her and make them feel even a fraction of the pain and rage that was consuming me. But I didn't. I sat on that balcony and breathed through the fury and continued organizing my evidence like the strategic architect I'd become. Emotion was the enemy now. Emotion would make me act rashly, make mistakes, give him opportunities to spin the narrative in his favor. I needed to stay cold, stay calculated, stay 3 steps ahead of him at all times. That evening was our final formal dinner, the last night on the ship before we arrived back in Miami the following morning. The dining room was more crowded than usual, everyone dressed in their best clothes, celebrating the end of a successful vacation. Our table companions were animated, exchanging contact information, promising to stay in touch, already nostalgic for the week they'd spent together. The retired couple from Ohio asked about our plans for when we got home, whether we'd be returning to work immediately or taking a few extra days to decompress. My husband talked about his schedule, the meetings he had lined up, the projects requiring his attention. I listened to him lie with such practiced ease and marveled at my previous blindness. How had I never seen this before? How had I spent 8 years with this man and never noticed that his mouth moved, but truth rarely came out? After dinner, there was a farewell show in the main theater, a lavish production number with all the ship's entertainers performing together, singing songs about friendship and memories and the magic of the sea. People in the audience were crying, moved by the sentiment and the reality that their vacation was ending. My husband reached over and took my hand, squeezing it gently, probably thinking this would be a nice romantic moment to end our trip. I let him hold my hand while I thought about everything that would happen in the coming days and weeks, the confrontation I was planning. The lawyer I would hire, the divorce papers that would be filed, the division of assets and the possible alimony, and the complete dissolution of the life we'd built together. He had no idea what was coming. He thought he'd gotten away with it, thought his careful planning and his wife's trusting nature would shield him from consequences. He thought he was clever enough to maintain both relationships indefinitely, keep all his plates spinning without any of them crashing down. He was wrong. The crash was coming. I was going to make sure of it. That night, I didn't follow him when he left our stateroom for what would be his final rendezvous with his mistress on the ship. I didn't need more evidence. I had enough to bury him. Instead, I lay in the dark and planned the exact words I would say, the exact moment I would reveal what I knew, the exact way I would watch his face as he realized his perfect deception had been discovered. The thought filled me with a savage satisfaction that probably should have scared me, but didn't. I'd spent 8 years being the good wife, the understanding wife, the wife who didn't complain when her husband worked late or traveled frequently or seemed distant and distracted. I'd molded myself into the shape he needed me to be, made myself smaller and quieter and less demanding. And this was how he'd repaid that sacrifice, with lies and betrayal and a secret life that made a mockery of everything I'd believed about us, no more. The good wife was gone, burned away by the fire of his betrayal. What was left was someone harder, someone who understood that trust was a liability and love was a weapon that could be used against you. I didn't like this new version of myself, this cold and calculating person who could plot revenge with such detailed precision. But I respected her. She was a survivor. She wouldn't be fooled again. The ship docked in Miami early the next morning, the PA system announcing our arrival with a cheerful efficiency. I'd been awake for hours, packed and ready, sitting on our balcony watching the city grow larger as we approached. My husband slept soundly beside me for the last time, exhausted from his late-night activities, oblivious to the fact that this was the final morning of his comfortable double life. When he woke, I had coffee waiting for him, playing the attentive wife one last time. We went through the disembarkation process with hundreds of other passengers, queuing in designated areas, waiting for our color-coded group to be called, retrieving our luggage from the vast warehouse where thousands of bags had been sorted overnight. It was tedious and slow, and I was grateful for the distraction, for the logistical choreography that prevented conversation. We cleared customs, loaded our bags into the rideshare we'd arranged, and began the long drive home to Charlotte. My husband dozed in the back seat for most of the journey, waking occasionally to check his phone. Probably messaging her goodbye, probably making plans for when they'd see each other again. I stared out the window at the flat Florida landscape, giving way to Georgia's rolling hills, thinking about all the lies he'd told and would continue telling if I gave him the chance. But I wasn't going to give him that chance. The performance was almost over. Just a few more hours of pretending, of holding my tongue, of waiting for the right moment. And then I would speak, and his world would end. Did you like the story? Please leave a comment and tell me where you listened from. And if you haven't already subscribed to this channel, please hit that subscribe button now. Thank you so much. See you tomorrow for another inspiring tale.